Who wants to go first?
I'll help you out and go first.
Please do. Thank you.
All right. So I'm Pete Beckman from Argonne National Laboratory and Northwestern University. So in the supercomputing world, like the talk we just heard from Karen on digital twins, we're often pushing forward a physics-based model. So we have equations, we solve those equations, and we make predictions. And at the supercomputing level, as we heard earlier, we buy larger and larger computers we use weak scaling to make larger and larger predictions, whether it's in biological space or chemistry or astrophysics. I think that one of the keys in this space is we're making these predictions, but we don't usually close the loop. In other words, we don't go back. We're looking for fundamental insights in science, but we don't close that loop and turn that back around into something that's going to immediately change what's sort of on the ground. And so the concept that what I really love about the concept that Karen pointed out about digital twins is two features. So one is that a digital twin is an individual asset. So in the case of agriculture, that's not an idealized farm, that's a farm. It's a crop. So that's one feature. The second feature is it's dynamically updated. And this was in her definition that was in one of her first slides. And those two features from a supercomputing world, we have to translate to farming by closing the loop. So we have to not just predict forward an interesting material science problem that where cracks come from in stressed materials. We have to close the loop back to what happens in the case of climate change, in case of weather, in case of pests in the environment, what happens on that specific farm and in a time scale that's dynamically updated, so that's now. And yesterday I took the opportunity to go up to Zealandia. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. And I was thinking about your panel. And when I got there, there's a great big sign on the outside of the museum, this sort of eco space. And it just seemed to me to be like this panel. It had a quote from someone named Henry Bergson. And the quote is, "The future can no longer be what is going to happen, it is what are we going to do?" And so in supercomputing, we're fixated on the what's going to happen, but in agriculture, we really need to, and in our ecosystem, we need to answer the question, what are we going to do? And so my argument, my thesis here is that closing the loop is about time-sensitive computing. We have to dynamically update, and we have to bring the computing to something that's small enough that we can actually make progress, and these are the sort of the simple models that Karen talked about for each individual farm. A farm can't get time on our exascale computer, right? So we have to do that with open data, where we build AI surrogates from the open data that everybody participates in that can then make something small enough that we can run in real-time predictions and run and improve our agriculture.
Should I ask Lucy to follow?
Pardon?
Lucy, yeah. You have a microphone there.
Cool, thank you for that.
No worries.
So for those of you who don't know me, so firstly, I'm quite intimidated to be here actually. So I'm in the room with the brightest minds in supercomputing. This is amazing what I'm learning here, so thank you. So my background is slightly different. So I come from a farm, and my parents still farm down the bottom of New Zealand in Southland. And I work for the Ministry for Primary Industries, and there I manage the COVID recovery and supply chain team. I also have a scholarship, so there I'm looking at data interoperability on farm. So how do we connect the different systems that all of the computing is run through and the sensors that we have on farm? So really enjoyed the talks this afternoon. Karen, your talk about digital twins, love it. And what you're talking about for the sensors, all of the information we need to get, the supercomputers, all of that work. The challenge is there is very low data literacy on farm. So how do we do the value add? How do we share what we're doing and get farmers to buy into it? Because I think Nicholas's questions up there of who is it for is really important. Who are we doing this for, right? Is it for the farmer? Is it for us as the people who eat the food? Is it for the government? Who are we trying to sell the systems to? Because there needs to be a value add, and that goes back to the business proposition for it. So I think that's really important. And it's been mentioned a few times here as well around the decision maker, right? So who's the decision maker you're making to? So Karen, you alluded to that as well with the digital twins, and that someone mentioned as well the explainability. So I think that's where we need to start. So what are we trying to achieve? And then we're talking here at the moment a lot about the how. And I think that's great. Like, this is a great forum to do that in, but we need to bring those decision makers into the mix as well and get them as part of this. So that's my comment to all of that.
No, and I think that you touch a very important point that I've been trying to bring together for many, many years. I mean, Vicky could witness that, and Ian as well, probably 5 years by now. There are silos of people talking about fantastic things here and people fantastic things there, and the ones who make the decision. I mean, the largest venture capitalist in any country, it's called the government. It's simple as that. But the decisions that that government takes is not necessarily on due diligence venture capital style. And then to undo those decisions in the long term, it's again extremely cost expensive. So may I ask Jeffrey to continue? Sure. We have 2 microphones there.
So I'm Jeffrey Vetter from Oak Ridge National Lab, and I also happen to be a farm owner.
Wow.
So I may be uniquely qualified here, I don't know, but a recent farm owner. So one of the first things I did when COVID started was I thought, wow, I'm going to be grounded for a long time, and I'm going to have a lot of free time on my hands. So I bought a farm, and so I raise blueberries and blackberries right now. So that's entertaining. The thing I would like to bring up when I'm looking at this is I'm a big fan of precision agriculture, and it lets you do things like optimize your fertilizer, your land use, other things like that. But one thing that's shocked me that I've learned over the past few years is the need for fertilizer and the way fertilizer is produced. Some people estimate it takes about 10% of the world's energy production to generate all the fertilizer we need. And so when you look at things like high performance computing and even quantum computing in some respects, one of the things you want to be able to do is look at more energy efficient ways to make fertilizer. And so when I'm thinking about this question about how can we make food more secure, how can we make it more inexpensive, how can we make it more widespread, I think one of the ways to do that would be to look for more energy efficient processes for fertilizer production. Right now there are about, I was looking at this before I got up here because I didn't want to misquote the number, but they talk about thousands of gigawatts of power being used in the Haber process to make ammonium nitrate and fertilizers like that are used everywhere. And if you think about, Amdahl's law or 80-20 rule or whatever, if you could shave some energy off that would be a great stride for both climate change as well as food production and many other things. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and maybe we can talk about that.
Karen, thank you. I didn't know that you were a farmer.
I was going to say, I
Lot
feel...
of secrets coming up today.
I feel uniquely unqualified to be sitting up here. Though where I grew up on the edge of Auckland is now fully suburbia, but it was farmland at the time. But all right. Quite seriously, I am uniquely unqualified to make comments here. And I'm also, I guess, not really aware of what state of the art is in the thinking of digital twins around agriculture. I mean, I know precision agriculture is a theme, but being unqualified to comment on something never stops a good academic. So let me just share. I've already said a lot today, but just a couple thoughts. Nicholas, you keep posing this question: is it worth it to do a digital twin? Is some of the questions up here for agriculture. Maybe just the first thing is, and we've already touched on this a little bit, we have to just caution against the notion, the digital twin we say digital twin, and what comes to mind, so what's in everybody's mind right now? A beautiful visualization of the farm with the individual crops represented and, you know, the individual, Farmville, right. So, and I've already said it, but let me just repeat it again, that and you said it, Pete, is you have to think about what decisions you have to make, and it's the function of the digital twin that has to be a driver here. And so I think it's just really, really important, and especially if you're communicating with people who are not experts, to set the expectations and to drive whatever the digital twin is in a way that's actually useful. So the second thing is, when is a digital twin most valuable? I think a digital twin is most valuable, first of all, when there's tremendous variability, meaning different instances are different from each other. There's a lot of variability, and when there's a lot of uncertainty maybe in the external environment, because those are both situations where there's value in modeling the individual and value in closing the feedback loop. And so if I were trying to decide about whether to do a digital twin of my farm, I would ask myself, what are the decisions that I have to make that are most affected by variability and uncertainty? And then I would go on and ask the question, you know, at what scales? You talked about fertilizer. I mean, are we talking about the scales that are from season to season, or are we talking about the scales on any given day? And I guess my one qualification on being here is I actually visited Caterpillar just a few months ago. And I mean, Caterpillar are incredible, right? They are one of the companies that has long been very sophisticated users of modeling and simulation, and I was really impressed to hear some of their thinking and you know, around what they're building into their machines and the sensing, because of the changing, now I'm going to talk about farms and I'm going to get it wrong, but the changing, for example, soil conditions from day to day, the variability from day to day, and how you could optimize the operation of the machine. But really sort of thinking through that, and it doesn't have to be Farmville. It actually could be a digital twin of one small piece where there's a lot of value in bringing the decision making.
I think that the core is on value, because I mean, I remember a Caterpillar guest speaker at SC17 or something like that. It was a fantastic presentation. We were 20 people listening to that. And it was still more than the year prior that someone from DoD, Department of Defense, was talking about simulation, about planes. And I was probably the only guy without a suit. Everyone was looking at me, who is this guy asking questions? But one thing I remember from there, we are designing, now that we are simulating everything, we are saving literally 25 years of tests. Because before that, we started to fly the planes, and well, things take some money to replace. So simulation, digital twins, I see the value. I just tried to see, it was Duncan who put the linear programming, where is the intersection? Because I start to think the monumental amount of effort that we need to put together to do something, when is it starting to be worthwhile? You are a farmer, a little farmer, big farmer, I don't know. You're still definitely smaller than a country or a state. So when start to make sense? But then government scale has the budget, but then it's a government imposing us stuff. Not because government, but because government usually buy from an established vendor, which already is imposing a model that worked for somewhere else. So I expect your maverick opinion, Paul.
I'm sorry to contradict a fellow panelist, but you're not the least qualified. I am. Okay, but I'm going to be looking at some past experiences. I was involved in agriculture as a child. That's back when the child labor laws were different in my homeland, and so everybody went out to the berry and bean fields and harvested. So there's that, I suppose. I also have some relatives in agriculture. Before I get to that, though, to your point about Haber process ammonia and fertilizer, one possibility is that might be how we handle the load imbalance for renewables. Although I'm sure that if somebody actually knew something about the Haber process, they'd tell me why that wouldn't work. And they'd probably be right, but you know, what the heck, right? We're a panel here. The other thing is we shouldn't lose track of the low-tech approaches. This is a later thing. My family would go out to harvest blueberries just for our own use, you pick sort of a thing. And suddenly one year the place is full of weeds. I mean, before that, they had very carefully tilled and removed all the weeds. You just had these blueberry plants with dirt in between, and here there's weeds up to like here, and you're sometimes having to trim. It turned out that that wasn't for fertilizer, but for insecticide. It turns out that the native insects where I live prefer the native plants. If you give them an option other than blueberries, they'll eat the other stuff that they're used to. And so there may be some fairly simple things like that that could potentially make a big difference. I have a daughter who works at a research institute in pollination and mostly pollination processing, does some modeling, although I don't think it's anywhere near the digital twin. That'd be a low resolution digital twin of a field with insects, I suppose. And I have a nephew who works on large animal science at a university in the States. But I'm going to talk about my father-in-law, who was a dairy farmer, also raised wheat, partly to get the hay for the cows over the winter. He had a reputation in the hometown because in a period of 40 years, and one of the things about hay is when you harvest it. Because if you harvest it at the wrong time, it rains, and the weather here is kind of like there, okay, it's going to rain. And if you do it at the wrong time, you'll end up rotting your crop. And he had a reputation because out of 40 years, 39 of them, when he harvested the hay was the right time. Only 1 year did he mess up and get his crop rained on. And his problem was, and there was several of you talking about the feedback control. He didn't use feedback control. He used a fairly low-tech technique, which is called a shortwave radio. And he tuned his radio. Now, he lives in the middle of Oregon, in the Willamette Valley. And so some hundreds of kilometers north is a city called Vancouver, BC, that you might have heard of. It's a cheap imitation. The real one is, of course, in Washington State, right in Portland. But the one in Washington State was there first, but it started from scratch and stayed there, okay? So, you got to be careful. In any case, he tuned his shortwave radio to BC, to Vancouver, BC, and once Vancouver, BC reported sun for 2 weeks, he says, great, this is the time to... would anybody care to guess which year he got it wrong? 1980. Would anybody care to guess what caused him to get it wrong? Very good. Good job there. And he didn't have feedback control, so the fact this volcano erupted halfway through the weather reports meant that VC was no longer a good digital twin of Yamhill, Oregon. And that tripped him up. But again, I'm lacking, so I brought my good friend along. This is my good friend because Nicholas said it was my good friend. ChatGPT.
I was wondering how long it was going to take.
Okay, so keep that microphone, please. So I want to keep some civilization in this and trying to converge. I mean, yes, it's a panel. One thing that I learned in the number of years in the past, dealing with non-agriculture related people entering into the field, they always want to share a story. They always have a parent or a grandparent or something, and then they enter into the story, and it's not personal. It's just... and
it charges as read.
Whatever. So the point is, in the other hand, the farming community, or I prefer to call it primary sector, because I mean, forestry or fisheries, they're all facing monumental amount of problems, and we discussed those problems in Karen's keynote. So, in the other hand, this community, let's call it HPC or next generation or quantum or edge or whatever, is dealing with probably the only computing capability that can actually address those problems. And in some way, we need to converge. At some stage, we need to converge. Because otherwise, we are just going to solve a problem with one vendor providing. And we in the IT world, we saw that. It was called Windows. It's not necessarily the best solution, but it leveled something. So what I'm trying for the panel, using both microphones, please, to start to converge, right? It would be ideal to have a couple of farmers here, but we have the more than farmers. We have the ministry representative here and there, and other people from the New Zealand government. And all what we are trying to do in this community is trying to build something towards New Zealand being a test bed, or I believe is a right size to do good things. So, who wants to fight first? I know that Pete is the first one, but let's make it the second. Lucy, do you want to say?
Okay, so New Zealand being a test bed. Yeah, so I think we can, but we do have a very different system to other countries because we're pastoral based, right? We farm on the land. In a lot of countries, like the dairy farming and beef, they're in feedlots or they're indoor barned, so it's different. When it comes more to robotics and horticulture, then definitely we can be a test bed for those things. But I think a really big thing is partnering with the other countries and seeing where we can really find those efficiencies in partnering. And you talked earlier about your weather stations, right? In November last year, I was in South Australia putting up those weather stations in that form already. So why are you not talking to them, would be my question back to you.
Because you didn't fund me.
You didn't show me that, so, so we can talk after.
Correct,
Yeah.
yes.
So yes, it's about not reinventing the wheel. I think it's really important because we're very good at that in every country. But we face the same big problems: water, labour, climate change, all of them. We're all seeing adverse weather events. I mean, we have one right here in New Zealand right now. You're all experiencing that, but you've got them in North America and in Europe as well. Like the driest, the heat waves. Mississippi was dry last year. Like you're getting the corn out at that time. That's really difficult. So yeah, for me, I think a really big thing around us being a test bed, yes, definitely, but so is every other country. We need to be working together. We need to have collaborations and connections across the world.
Perfect. Pete. Or Jeffrey, or whatever.
Yeah, I totally agree, and there are ways to divide problems up so you can get more people looking at them. And so this is, a great thing that happens with the separation of data and simulation. So just collecting data on farms and at soil level, the kinds of lightweight sensors that my group and other groups have done, and making that open so that people who aren't even in that industry can be looking at the data and exploring new relationships, looking at new AI ways to explore is a great way to do it. The NSF has launched in the United States several AI institutes, and I am not part of the one I'm going to mention right now, so it's not my work at all, but I do share the state with them. I'm in Illinois, and this institute is in the farming area of Illinois. And if you go to the website is aifarms.illinois.edu. There are, it's one of the NSF-funded institutes specifically for how do we bring advanced computation to, to actual farming. And so everything from little rovers that go up and down, rows of plants to find weeds and remove that specific weed as opposed to spray the whole crop, all sorts of new ideas. So I do think that breaking open the problem and sharing it so that people can attack different parts of it is the best path forward for us.
I'm happy to open to questions to the floor or opinions. Yes, we have in the back, please. We got two in the back. So first Ben and then Paolo.
Hi. I wanted to bring up something that you mentioned earlier is who owns these things? If we have this ecosystem, who owns the devices? Who owns the data? If I'm part of this human ecosystem that's monitoring my health, how do I know who's accessing that data? And it really opens up a lot of questions in my mind.
And it's not just ethical questions. I mean, leave that apart. When I put in my slides at the very beginning is that, okay, what is the business model? I mean, it's not about doing money, but someone needs to fund this towards somewhere. It's Paolo. It's not live. Yes.
So is there some low-hanging fruit or leaving on the table because it's not kind of too technologically advanced? For example, I was reading about ways to do waste heat recovery from data centers, and there are creative ideas. Like in Sweden, they're growing lettuce. I remember the folks in Bologna were telling me they want to use that to hatch chicken eggs, and so I mean there are like hundreds of terawatt hours per year that are wasted from data center heat. And we're only taking advantage of a really, really small percentage of that. That is not, too hard to do, but of course there's no incentive system today for, those two industries to be in symbiosis, right? So, question is to anybody. I mean, is there something there that we should be doing a bit more actively here?
So, I mean, Ben raised something, and then Paolo, who wants to take the heat?
No pun intended. The waste heat.
Don't be shy. Now suddenly you become shy.
So, I mean, well, I mean, since it's a panel, I don't have to be right. So
Correct.
So I went to on vacation to Jackson, Wyoming a couple of years ago, and right across the street from us was a farm, and it was for micronutrient, micro lettuce, things like that, right? And it's because it's in Jackson, Wyoming, they don't get very much good weather to grow those types of things, and they needed to grow it year round for the restaurants and the local people. I mean, I think that would be a fantastic idea if you had some way to capture the wasted heat. But for example, in Tennessee, I don't know if that idea would float very well, just because we have a lot of heat, especially during the summertime there. There may be other interesting things you could do with that heat, but just for like heating a greenhouse or something like that, it's very location dependent.
I mean, the incentive system would be to create the environment so that those two things are in symbiosis, right? So if you need to create a data center, put it where you need heat, where you have a heat network, rather
Right.
than in the equator,
Right.
or vice versa, that kind of stuff. You can
Yeah,
grow
there's
lettuce in a place where you normally wouldn't, because now you have free heat, because it's fueled by the other 8% of GDP that Nicola's talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea. One of the largest indoor farms, and I think in the United States, is about 100 miles from us in Kentucky. And the reason they put it there was because it was 70% of the U.S. population lives within 8 hours of that location, right? And it's all managed, it's indoor, they grow virtually all kinds of plants, but it's an interesting concept. If they could use energy somehow, maybe to change the water, or do something, sterilize the water, do those kinds of things you need to do as well.
I don't know, I just can add, let's go back to the question in one way or other, which I took those figures because Paul sent me that, and I used the USA because Paul came from the USA. I dispute that will be very different in other countries. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily matter, but I have my intuition that it will be relatively similar, that other areas than primary sector has certain external output. And still, I like that comment at the end somewhere, that might we found ourselves with a lot of digital twins and data centers and AI and the food. So, Bo, you are...
Yeah, I have a question. I guess I'd challenge you a bit, as in, how interventionist do you think we should be into precision agriculture? Because I'd imagine that people in precision agriculture, you give them low-hanging fruit or an interesting problem, they'll adopt that 100%. I think the interesting aspect is, how do you open source enough of that data to be useful in building a digital twin? So say if you tie it more to Australia, where it's more cattle right throughout northern Australia, I imagine farmers, and you could sponsor this by government, would be hugely supportive of, say you had accelerometers attached to cows, like collars. Mm-hmm. And so you'd have an idea of their movements, maybe in a gyroscope, say. Pretty low cost gear. As they move around, you could probably detect, say, predators by how irregular their gait is. To say there's a dingo that's coming here, and they'll pick up the pace, and maybe either their herd behavior or just how they move. But that might be ill-suited to, say, if you wanted to detect the yield of the cow, because you have no biomass indicators, you have no idea how much fertilizer has been applied or how green the soil is. You couldn't even infer, say, heart rate predictably. I mean, there would be a good amount of error to say, my cows were under a huge amount of stress this season, and so, they probably haven't had good conditions for weight gain. And it wouldn't be until you apply another problem that you'd really be able to access that data. And often that data's been error prone You know, like there's been a value judgment. They're not storing all of the data of every second.
So, do we have yes, Lucy?
Yeah, I'll answer that one. So we have a lot of different systems that capture those things already, right? So we've got halters on cows. That's pretty common in Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, over in the US as well. That's a common technology now. The challenge is that, like you're talking about, yes, you've got it for the monitoring of the animal itself, and you can detect heat and things like that as well. You've got different monitors within the milking parlour that will measure yield and production statistics and things like that. None of that maps to your land production, how much is actually being eaten by that cow. So you can't match the data. That's the biggest problem. How do you connect those different systems across the farm so that the farmer can then look at the digital twins and say, okay, well, now I can do some scenario planning of if I use less fertilizer, what does that do to my production at the other end? Right? So it's that connection of the systems that's the big problem. So you guys here, the great minds of the supercomputing world, help us fix this.
And that's the question. Anyone? Oh, now you're suddenly shy. I'm serious. I mean, that's why I convene all this. So it's a real problem. And that when I said on my original talk that all the technologies that it's applied on the primary sector are mature or outdated, it's because they are being used. I mean, they're measuring a lot of stuff, but they're not bringing it together. And we are bringing it together is based on a model of what? And that's when I'm trying to ask the topology question, which is the low level. Do we need new axiomatic? Do we need to do the Lobachevsky geometry, which is a very nerdy comment? So what I'm trying to say is, we are going towards 10, 20 years of crisis, and we have solutions or not, but they are not converging. And my humble effort is just to convene this, but please, let's start to think together. Yes? Okay, Bo.
Is it just closing the loop as a new problem comes up, or a more holistic? So we get a better holistic picture as we add more and more problems, where we could revisit the data we've already collected, and if we already know we have a system that collects heat of cows, you tie it into another system that's wants to detect predator behavior or something. Do we have to put pressure on the open data?
I think that the pressure is in the government that they need to do stuff. And then they say, well, we do as much as we can with the tools that we have. And then we complain about the tools because they buy tools which are in the market. And then we say, okay, those tools are crap. And they say, well, and now you're telling me.
Right.
What you have done before.
I'll chime in. Just a couple things that have come to mind over this discussion is, I don't know if it's like this in New Zealand, but in Tennessee in the United States, we generally have an extension service that reaches out to all the farmers and interacts with them because they're, maybe like me and have no idea about what they're supposed to be doing, right? And so you call these people up and they come out to your farm and they really give you guidance about how to raise things. It would be really nice if that was a lot more automated and they could come out and say, look, blueberries acidity level has to be like 5 and that's really low, so you need to go out and buy some elemental sulfur and other things and put that on the berries immediately. It would be nice to have all that just completely automated, the same way I look at my weather forecast, right? So I could just pull all that up and understand it. The second thing is, I didn't realize farming was such a cutthroat business. It's, the margins are very thin, right? And one season can make or break kind of your profit for the year. And so
should be like that?
What's that?
Should be like that?
Well, no, it shouldn't be like that. I mean, it should be, you should be able to make a reasonable profit.
No, but I'm not talking from the market perspective, but I'm talking about aren't huge amount of inefficiencies baked into the existing system just because always has been like that?
Well, yeah, but it's a huge amount of risk. Some of it's not inefficiency, it's risk, right? You have a late frost one year and you're 20% of the production of the previous year.
But with the right tools that you're using for other things, with the magnificent machines, you can reduce that risk.
To some degree, yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, you can put it all
measure that
in a greenhouse, right?
Can we converge into, okay, what are we arguing here? Because I'm not trying to do high tech. I'm trying to do mundane tech.
Right.
But I dispute the fact to feed, I don't know, 10 billion people for 2050, we need to increase our food production by 70%, therefore increase pollution. And I can quote you all the whatever trendy data. Why should that be given? Why we cannot look and do optimization again? So what do we have to say about that? Yes?
All right. I'll give an example. I went to the store, and there were carrots, of course, it's with carrots, but they're carrot-shaped carrots, okay, which when I was a kid, I would have expected. I got the first hint that this might change in college. One of my friends worked at a carrot farm, and he told me that something like 2/3 of the carrots were plowed back into the soil because they weren't carrot-shaped. Some guy in Southern California, unknown to either of us a few years later, took a bean chopper, the thing that chops beans up into small pieces, you get these bags of chopped beans, and he re-rigged it to work on carrots, which meant they could take these non-share-shaped carrots that have multiple roots and branch roots and so on, chop them into pieces, and sell most of the pieces. They call them baby-cut carrots. I'm serious, that's what they call them. I mean, well, he didn't patent the idea and he gave it to everybody else, so I think he's probably still in the cutthroat business, but at a different productivity level, which, but it did increase the efficiency.
No, I mean,
the thing, so I'm kind of come back around to what you're saying there. We need to instrument, but I think we need to instrument more than just the farms themselves, but also how the stuff gets used and what happens to it.
So my premise about system of systems is, anyway, this is getting maybe, yes, Ian, please, can you have a microphone here? Thank you.
Yeah.
He used to be the president of the International Society of Precision Agriculture worldwide, so he will say something.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, I think we get bogged down in thinking that there's one solution. There's not one solution. Mm-hmm. We've talked about there's potentially we could think about hundreds of little solutions that would help, not solutions to the whole problem. I do think that one of the things that we really have a real challenge with is global warming and climate change, that we're really beginning to see some major effects from that. And I don't personally have the confidence that as an agricultural industry worldwide, we have the capability to get the type of increases in production, increases in efficiency that we need unless we do something more than we're doing at the moment. And I think that's where the kind of opportunity for some of this more kind of joined up thinking that we need in terms of how do we cope with these sorts of things is really important. So I'll give you another example. I talked to a colleague in Australia just recently. And so one of the things that's happening in New Zealand is in the last 4 years I've been working mainly in the horticultural sector. And what I've noticed is we've had a particular weather pattern over the last 3 years, and it's producing some very marked results in terms of most of our product production is up in the north, or northern part of the North Island or North Island. And where we used to get most of the sun, now it appears we get most of the rain. And I was sort of interested in talking to this colleague in Australia, saying, well, how do you cope? Because what we're finding is that the fruit quality, the sugars in the fruit, etc., are all changing because of the growing conditions are changing, and it's causing major problems. And we've got some problems that there's one, the kiwi fruit industry, I think, is worth about $6 billion a year to us, and there's one particular problem is worth, we think it's cost something like 500 million in one industry this last year. It's probably climate related. I'm not saying there's one single answer. And I was asking him, so in Australia, if you look how much the weather patterns in Australia have changed from the 2000s to what's happening now, you mentioned Northern Australia and how, and looking at grazing systems, for example, the environment has totally changed. So I was asking him, so how does the horticultural industry in Australia cope with these changing weather patterns, and what effect is it having on the quality of fruit and productivity, etc., etc.? And his answer to me was, he says, actually nobody's come to me and said that this is the case. They're simply not aware of what's happening. And the same, I deal with the Apple industry, the same things are happening. And that's why I kind of worry that we just simply don't have the data. We've talked about sparsity of data. We've got to get better data to understand what the heck is going on. Those inside-out models, I think, there's a lot of merit in looking at that. That's something that I've been trying to do for the last few years, because I think the older way of the sort of inside-out has failed us really in terms of the adequacy of the explanation of just what's happening and the variability of what's happening. It's the variability of biological systems that I think is one of the key things, and that's why I think we've got to get it down to almost the individual plant level. And so, you talk about a kiwi fruit vine, we know that the quality of fruit varies over the vine. It's not just over the orchard, actually within the individual vine. But it's how do you cope with those sorts of things? And it's not going to be that we're going to come up with a perfect answer, but there are things that we could start doing that are data-driven that would actually help raise productivity, I think, maybe say 10, 15%, these sorts of things. So we've really got to get our act together, and we're not doing it at the moment, and so what's happening, and I don't know if the same thing's happening in the States, or
We are supposed to be the clever people, aren't we?
well, yeah, but I mean, I don't want to be impolite, but some of the industries are basically shitting themselves because they're seeing these major problems, and their reaction, I've seen it from stopping spending money in R&D to now thinking, okay, well, we've got to do something, but we're actually not sure what.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, at the very least, we are raising the topic. So there is a question there. Yes, Duncan. Is it working? So is that working now?
Just start talking.
Can I talk? Oh, it's working now. These are all great ideas from a supply side perspective from agriculture, how you might improve efficiency and so forth. But I'm going to take a completely different simple engineer's perspective and look at it from the demand side. So I would liken most agricultural activity as producing a commodities of one form or another, that are then sold into a market, and the provider has virtually no control over the market price of a commodity. So it's effectively a monopsony, which is the opposite of a monopoly. So that's one single buyer market. What's the market that buys the commodity? And so I think the way forward for a small country like New Zealand is to differentiate your product by turning it into not a commodity. So it's the quality of the product that really counts, and that's where IT and supercomputing and so forth can come to the fore. So we should be able to trace back individual cuts of meat on a supermarket shelf in Manchester back to the farm that they were produced in New Zealand, and have a little story on the packaging related to that meat, or the kiwi fruit that is sold somewhere else in the world has it's traceable back to a particular vine on a particular farm in New Zealand, and it's nuclear free and organic and whatever else, however else we might want to differentiate that product from a commodity product. So that to me is the opportunity, is on the other side.
So these are really. I mean, in a small country, Uruguay, my home country, is even smaller than New Zealand, and I came to learn that it's a global leader in traceability. And not because, the IT industry is good, but it happens by necessity.
I guess I'm building on the notion of thinking up on the revenue side, and those very frustrating little plastic stickers are on every piece of fruit you buy in a supermarket. Why can't they be useful rather than just being a generic, this is a kiwi fruit? Why couldn't they actually have a code on them that tells you a lot about its origin? When it seems to be
okay, Ian has some contacts in the... Pete, you want to answer?
I was just going to point out two things. One is that asking scientists policy questions is always a bad idea. So I think where many of us might be able to excel or might be able to help out is on the science question side. And I would say that one thing that in the United States has worked well is to build very diverse teams that are multidisciplinary. So rather than trying to solve a particular problem with a data scientist or an IT guy or someone in biology, building teams that have each of those disciplines represented, and in many complex systems, then you're allowed to have scientists who can think outside the box and do that sort of pushback on, well, what could we do here? What would we need to instrument? Well, if I change the instrumentation, what would we need to do with respect to the uncertainty? How does that affect the biological system? So, my suggestion in terms of how we might work together and what a path forward might be is, what does it look like to have a multidisciplinary team that focuses on these kinds of problems from a science perspective?
Yeah, just to respond to that. So one of the most successful examples I saw of that was actually in the States. So I was over there in California last year, and I went and saw Western growers. And so California, breadbasket for the United States mainland. I mean, they provide 2/3 of the fresh fruit and nuts and 1/3 of the vegetables that you guys eat, really. So Western Growers is their largest membership-based organisation for the orchards and vegetable growers there. And what they've done is, at the moment, the harvesting of the crops there is quite manual. Right? I mean, when you're driving through there, you see teams of people harvesting these crops. What they want to do is by 2030, 50% of that will be automatically harvested. That's a huge undertaking, right? I mean, you've got to get the robotics right. You've got to get all of the data right for how it's going up and down the field. And it's a lot of supercomputing in that. So how are they doing that? That's with that multidisciplinary team you're talking about. So they've basically got the Centre of Innovation of Excellence there in Salinas, and they have the groups there that come and they focus purely on the mechanical arm that lifts the fruit out of whatever it needs to. And it's, that's what they're focusing on. They're working with the John Deere's and all the rest of them that provide the data so that it's automatically done, and they can, match that to the mechanical side. And then they've got a really strong relationship with the farmers. And that, I think, is the key.
That was a private or government lead initiative?
It was what, sorry?
A private or government lead initiative?
It was done by the farmers because the farmers recognised that during COVID they couldn't get labour from Mexico. So there was a lot of fruit and vegetables that weren't harvested over that time. And so they saw, we need to do something about this. And so they did get some government funding, but most of it comes from the farmers themselves. Mm-hmm. And then Western Growers, as that membership body, they were the ones that pushed for it. And so that's where you've got them all working together. But that I think the key is that link back to the farmers, because it means you can prototype things there and you can test things on the land. It doesn't have to be right the first time, because everybody wants to go out there and have it right the first time, but you don't have to. As long as you're testing and making improvements, that's what you want.
Yeah. All right. Oh, yes. Suddenly we have questions. Jim.
Okay. Two things. One is, I think we need to think about challenge problems. And Lucy, you pointed out agriculture in California. There's a challenge that California farmers are going to face, and that is the conflicting priorities over water. Many of the crops that are grown in California are very water intensive. And so changing the makeup of what crops are grown in the farms is going to be a big challenge. And then how you manage water usage. And then, all right, that's one question. The second, I wanted to respond to Duncan regarding crops that have high value. And I know in New Zealand, of course, there's a wine region. Okay, and we're getting direct evidence. I'm in the part of Washington State in the United States that is near the Columbia River Valley, and that's one of the significant premier AVAs for many red grapes, Bordeaux, Cabernet Franc, so forth. So one of the things that's unique about crops or agriculture for fruit, i.e. grapes, for wineries is all those vines are really very manual intensive with respect to manicuring of the vines and the care of the fruit. That's clearly a high value crop, and I'm wondering what the differences might be between, grapes that are destined for wine versus grapes that are just commodity. So and what the implications might be for how much digital twin or I don't know, the
So
impact might be.
I don't have the, I don't want to answer. I just want to say, in my view, the tools are there. And that's why I posed the question that we are trying to answer here. So how are we going to help? So Ian, where's the microphone running? Is there a microphone running somewhere? And the other microphone, where is it? There we go. So one there, and David in the meantime. Yes, go ahead.
One of the biggest challenges in food supply is actually food wastage, not at the supermarket. There's a lot of wastage when it's being sold, but there's a crazy amount of food wastage in consumers' homes, like scary numbers, like 30 to 40% of food is discarded, probably well before it's actually expired. So one of the things that we've been exploring was essentially like a litmus paper, but a gas exchange membrane with a color change. So it could be a cheap sticker that could then be used with a cell phone to do image processing to try and determine senescence of the food. I think that idea that you obviously have to produce a lot less food if you don't have to throw away 40% of it. So I thought that was a really interesting area that could be explored. Better understanding of how to store and use food. And the main reason for throwing it away early is just because all of the expiry date labels are so conservative because no one wants to get sued.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I give you a simple example. It's happening today, right here, right now. I mean, we have 70 people registered. Thanks to Gabrielle, we have a lot of empty seats. I budgeted to feeding all these people, and they are not here. So, of course, if each of you brought their Tupperware to bring food home, but you see my point where I'm coming from. And that's not a hard problem, but I mean, the people from catering, they need to get rid of the food for health and safety reasons. So, Ian.
Yeah, maybe I can just respond to partly Duncan's question that he asked, that he asked, but some of the statements that he made, and also just responds to what you said. I decided a couple of years ago, I moved up to a place called the Bay of Plenty, and it's well named because, I mean, you can grow fantastic fruit and vegetables there. So I decided, we had about an acre of garden, so I decided, right, we've got some avocado trees, and I'm going to grow a garden, and I'm going to grow our own food. And it was really then when I realized how conditioned we were to supermarkets and our buying patterns, and the difficulty is not in growing the food, the difficulty is understanding how to consume it. And that's one of the things that a big lesson that I've learned is around that. But what I also wanted to say just around some of the points made was, I think what we've got to do, and maybe trying to bring it back to how can we solve some of these problems, and we talked about wine. And if you look at the history of wine and how we've described, the different characteristics of wine, and you mentioned the valleys, etc. So we talk about the term terroir, and it's about a different environment that we grow our wine in, and there are very subtle differences. I actually believe what we need to do is have a digital terroir for every place that we grow fruit, food, whatever. We need to have a digital terroir that we really begin to understand a lot of the characteristics of that particular environment that we can utilize, that we can improve the efficiency with which we grow our food, etc. And I think that could be the contribution, if you like, of that digital twin approach, is to really understand a lot of these sorts of issues and get it down to that level.
Yes.
Yeah,
well, that's
I would characterize it as a digital Appalachian contrôlé. So, the guarantee on the label that it is, it is what's it says on the tin or in the bottle.
Yes.
One thing that may help, if you have related crops, some of which are high value and not, the grapes and wine being an example, you may be able to fund development of the technologies, the high value stuff, and as the price cost decrease, get it into the lower ends of the market.
I like to close with your sentence about there's not a difficulty of growing food, but we need to learn how to consume better. I think that's a good sentence to finish. So I want to thank you, everyone. Well, you wanted to say something else. So, on that note, I want everyone to join me to say thank you to the panel, because at the end of the day,